There are several ways of authentication in ASP.NET Core applications. One of those is the API Key Authentication. So based on the HTTP header and the value of it, your API will decide if the user will obtain the specific resources or he will receive the authentication failure response. If you would like to know more about .NET, don't forget to click on the subscribe button down below, to give me a like under this video if it was helpful for you, to write the comment, and now let's get straight into the topic. Alright guys, so as you can see on the screen, I have brand new created .NET 9 web API with this template code. The first thing to do in order to implement API key authentication will be, of course, to store somewhere the API key header and the API key value. So in the app settings JSON file, I'll create the new section called authentication. And inside of it, we'll have the API key section. And inside of it, we'll have the header name, which will be the X API key, and as the value, so the key will be the randomly created global unique identifier. So in my case, it will be this value. Now we'll create the options class that will fetch this configuration section, and then we'll be able to use this options with this specific class in order to get the values of the header name and header key in the filters or middlewares that we'll create shortly. So now I need to create a directory called options, and inside of it I'll create API key options.cs class, and in here we need to define at first the specific section in the app settings JSON file. So it will be the public const string authentication API key, and it will look as follows. So authentication API key. I would like to check once more time. Yeah, we have authentication and API key, and then we will have the header name and the key itself. So going back to the API key options, we have to create two properties: public required string header name get and set, and the public required as well as string, and it will be called key, just to be compliant with those two property names. Now we need to somehow register the API key options class in our DI container. So going back to the program CS file, we need to specify builder.services.configure with the type of our API key options, and inside of it we need to specify builder.configuration.get section, but not the API key, but the section will be called API key options.authentication API key. So just to point into this specific section in our app settings JSON file. When implementing API key authentication, you have to decide which one architectural approach to choose. So you have the middleware approach and the filter approach. So what are the differences between them? So the middlewares are the components that sit in the request response pipeline of the web application. So think of them like a chain of the gatekeepers. So each one has a chance to inspect, modify, or reject the request before it reaches the main logic of your API. So in API key authentication, the middleware can intercept every incoming request, look for an API key, usually in the headers, and decide whether to pass the request forward or block it. And the filters are more context specific, so they often work at the controller or action level, so right before your API method is executed. So they're very useful when you want finer grained control, so like applying authentication only to the certain endpoints or using different rules for different parts of the API. So if you know already that you would like to have the globally executed API key authentication in your whole API, then you should choose the middleware. If you know that some controllers or so endpoints will require the API key authentication and some not, then the filter approach is the best for you. Maybe just to prepare our environment, I'll create one more endpoint that will be inside of the normal MVC way. So I'll create the directory called controllers and I'll create weather forecast controller.cs, and inside of it we need to, of course, attach API controller, and then I will just copy the whole content of my previously created controller. So we'll have two endpoints. The first one, weather forecast controller 1. So this controller suffix will be applied just to differentiate between the minimal API endpoint and the MVC controller endpoint. So we'll have two of those that will do actually the same. And in the program CS file, we have the weather forecast endpoint that will have also here the minimal at the end, just to properly distinguish between all those endpoints. Then we'll add with tags, and it will be minimal API weather minimal API. So we'll have two endpoints in here and one endpoint over there. And now we can try to fill the API key.api.http file in order to be able to very quickly test our endpoints. In this HTTP file, we have the host address already that we can bind our requests to, and also what it accepts, so the application JSON content. So I'll just replace that with those three endpoints. So get, and get with the following localhost with the port and weather forecast minimal, weather forecast controller 1 and weather forecast controller 2. It accepts application JSON for all of those three endpoints. And now, in order to attach the API key that we would like to, of course, test, we need to have the section of the API key, so the header and the value of it. How we can do it in this file? So it will be the X API key and the value. So we have to copy the app settings JSON value out of that, and we can attach this value as follows. So I can copy this in all those three requests, and for now I'll just comment out just not to attach this to our requests. And once we are prepared with the HTTP file that will test our API, we can create the first part of the API key authentication. So the first approach, so middleware approach. I'll create the directory called middlewares, and inside of it I'll create the API key middleware.cs, and now we would like to create the constructor, and inside of it we'll inject the request delegate next and I options of the API key options, and inside of it, of course, we would like to introduce the read-only field request delegate, and also I'll create the private read-only API key options, and I will initialize those options based on this iOptions of the type API key options. Now we have to create one method called invoke async, so it will be public async task invoke async, and inside of it we have to check if in the HTTP context the request has the header of the specific header name, and then extract the value of that API key. Or also if the extracted API key is the same as what we have in our appsendings.json file, of course, just to check if this value is same as in the request itself. So now I'll create one very simple if statement. If in the context dot the request dot headers try get value, and this value will be called options dot header name out var extracted API key or extracted API key is not equal to our options dot key. So this check. Then we would like to attach to our context the status code of the type 401 unauthorized, because the user was not authorized in this case. Await context dot response dot write async, and we would like to, of course, attach some message. So API key is invalid, and after that we will just write return, and if it was successful, then of course we would like to invoke the next request delegate. So just to keep our request moving forward in our pipeline. And now we have to register our middleware in the DI container. So after the use HTTPS redirection, I will add this middleware. So it will be called app.use middleware with the type of API key middleware. Now I'll run my API and test with this minimal endpoint if, when I will not provide the proper API key, if I will receive the 401 unauthorized response or not. So I will just run this API. And now when we will run the HTTP request, we are getting 401 unauthorized response. And when I will uncomment this API key over there, then we are getting the response from our API. If the value will be incorrect, so I will just add, for instance, 6 at the end and save it. And then we'll have the breakpoint over there. And when I will run this request, we'll see that it checks if the value is the same as in our options. We see that not, then of course it's assigning the 401 unauthorized response, and the user is blocked and it's not able to get the resource from our API. Alright guys, so now there's the time to add those two endpoints to our DI container with the usage of the add controllers and map controllers method in the program CS file. Because for now, when we'll create just simply this API controller, we'll decorate with this attribute, it will not be present in our API. We need to add two lines. So builder.services.add controllers, and as well after the builder.build method, we need to add app.map controllers. And now when I will run this API and will run the request against those two endpoints, we'll get the 401 unauthorized when will not provide the API key for those. So when I'll comment out those two values and I'll run the request, as we see, API key is invalid, and here we are getting the response. And when I will uncomment there and there, we are getting the response from those two endpoints. So this is the proof that the API key middleware works for all of the endpoints that are present in our API. All right, guys. So now once we know that API key middleware works across the whole API and attached to all of the endpoints, there's the time to comment it out and create the filters. So the specific classes that are attached either on the minimal API endpoint or on the API controller itself for the whole controller, or to the specific endpoints separately. So I will create the directory called filters and will create two types of those filters. So the endpoint filter and authorization filter. The first one will be API key auth filter.cs, and the second one will be API key endpoint filter.cs. And here we have to implement authorization filter. I'll implement missing members, and we have to create the, of course, constructor that will inject the options, so our API key value and the header name. So options, API key options, and we have to introduce the read-only field, but of the type API key options, not I options of this type, and we have to use options dot value to get the whole content of the app settings JSON file related to our API key header name and the key itself. And now inside of it, we'll have the same check. So the same check as we have done over there. So I'll just copy it out of the middleware. But we have to get the context based on the different accessors. So we have the context dot HTTP context dot request dot headers. So we have to little bit modify it, and we'll have the context dot result is equal to the new unauthorized object result, and we'll provide the API key is invalid. And now this API key auth filter can be applied to all of the MVC controller endpoints, or to the whole controller, or on the specific endpoint itself when we'll register it. So how to register this API key auth filter? Very simply, we can just provide the options to the add controllers and use the opt.filters.add API key auth filter. But here we'll have the same case as for the middleware. It then will be applied across all the controllers. So for this purpose, the best approach will be not to do it this way, but just to register the filter as the scoped dependency. So it will be the add scoped of the type API key auth filter. And in this case, we will say on which endpoint or on which controller it has to be applied. So, for instance, when we would like to have service filter of the type API key auth filter on the whole controller, then it will be applied on those two endpoints. If we would like to have only one endpoint protected, for instance, this one, then we'll have only this one protected. So we have this flexibility in this case, it's not attached to all of the controllers and the endpoints. So now I'll run the API and we can test this out. So now going to the api.http and we have, as we see, only this endpoint is protected. So this endpoint 1, and we are getting unauthorized API key is invalid, and we are getting the result out of the endpoint 2 and of course the minimal API as well. When I will change the placement of this attribute to be applied on the whole controller, then minimal, of course, 200 OK response. Here we have 401 unauthorized and also unauthorized on this second endpoint. When we provide the proper values, then of course we are getting the responses from those two endpoints. And now the last part to implement will be the authentication filter, but on the minimal API. So API key filter for the minimal API will implement different interface. So it will be I endpoint filter. We have to implement missing members. And of course, we need to create the constructor and inject the API key header and also the key value from our app settings JSON file. So more or less as before we have done. So we have the options dot value because it will be those values from the app settings JSON file. Now we will have the header and the key. So the next thing to do will be to copy this if statement just to check if in the request itself we have the header with the value that will be the same as the value in our app settings JSON file. So this has to match with the request header value. So now going back to the endpoint filter, we can basically copy this if statement, but the content inside of this if statement will be different from this auth filter. We have to attach the context.http context.response.status code has to be 401 unauthorized, and we have to add await context.http context.response write async API key is invalid. We have to use the async keyword over there and then return await next. And we have to provide, of course, the context of endpoint filter invocation context. And now how we can use this API key endpoint filter on the minimal API endpoint, it will be pretty simple. So after the with name method, we'll use the add endpoint filter with the specific type, and this type will be API key endpoint filter. In this manner, it will be applied on this specific endpoint. So now when I will debug my API and will run the request, you will see that it will protect our minimal API endpoint. So now let's have a check. Weather forecast minimal. As you see, the API key endpoint filter was actually invoked, and inside of it we are getting the 401 unauthorized response because it was not present. Extracted API key was not valid at all because it was not present. So we are getting 401 unauthorized response. And now when we provide the value of the API key with the same as it should be based on our app settings JSON file, then we see 200 OK response. And once more time, when we don't have this or we have invalid, then we are getting 401 unauthorized response. Alright guys, so I hope that you liked the way that it was described. If yes, then please don't forget to click on the subscribe button down below to follow my latest videos about .NET. Make sure to give me a like and write the comment down below, and see you in the next one.